When I graduated college, I graduated with a major in secondary mathematics education and spent 7 years teaching high school students and coaching freshman football. And so for all of you educators, I just want to echo exactly what has been said and prayed by many people, that what you do truly matters and is radically difficult and eternally important. And so thank you. Listen, I want to begin with a question for all of you. Now, this is a question whether you follow Jesus or not. There are people searching to answer this question all the time, right and left. They're trying different ways, different methods. But here's my question. Have you encountered God? Like, have you experienced an encounter with God that you would have a difficult time expressing any other way? It doesn't need to be some crazy miraculous. It just needs to be a moment where God has been present to you in a way, has surrounded you, has strengthened you, has comforted you, has directed you, has pointed you, has supported you in a way that's like, man, there is no person on the planet who could have done that. That had to be God. Now, again, I said you don't even have to be a Christian to be searching for this. People are constantly looking for moments that transcend all the normalcy of life, that go beyond. In fact, I've been listening to this podcast called The Father's Collective by a guy named John Tyson, a pastor out of New York, and he and his 19-year-old son have been walking, or actually just finished walking, the Camino de Santiago, this pilgrimage 500 miles across Spain. And traditionally, it's this Catholic pilgrimage that's supposed to be a spiritual thing, but he says of all the people that he met, almost no one was there because they were Catholic or spiritual. They were just searching beyond the secular promises of if we can advance, achieve, technologize, and make everything efficient, that somehow that'll satisfy us. And there were people unwilling to walk 500 miles to find out if there's something beyond all of that noise, that would go a little bit deeper, that would reach farther in. We have a hunger for this, a desire for this. In fact, people look at the younger generation, less engaged in organized religion than ever, but no less spiritual. In fact, maybe far more spiritual, just looking for the real thing. Not a facade, not a practice, not a set of motions, but an encounter with the real, living God who actually cares deeply for them. And this is what we hope here at Canyon Ridge. It's actually what we mean when we say, join Jesus. We would step in because of the way that Jesus has made for us to encounter God, not just a higher power, not just something transcendent, not just the divine, but to look at Jesus and see exactly what God is like and that he has made a way for us. We get to step into this kind of life all the time. In fact, this is the kind of life that we want. A life characterized by encountering and experiencing God's presence over and over and over, watching God show up as we live and point our lives in his direction. If you haven't experienced that, it's open all the time. God's available all the time. He invites every single one of us, no matter where we come from, to experience and encounter him all the time. Have you encountered him? Have you experienced God? There's been moments for me, I'm going to shoot you straight, they're hard to describe. Like, there was once, I've talked about this before, but I went out behind this hotel at a resort in the Dominican where I was hanging out with some friends leading worship for their whole staff retreat, and I just spent time with God. A friend had challenged me to spend 2 or more hours alone with God, and I'm like, whoa, that sounds like a long time, right? And so let me just tell you, somehow around the last 2 verses of Psalm 139, I met with God in a way like I've never met with him before. He showed up in a way that I'd never seen before. I could talk about a night in the hospital here at UMC. I had open heart surgery back in January, and there was a night after I had kind of stabilized and gotten out of the anesthetic enough that my wife wasn't staying through the night anymore, and I was kind of alone. Nurses weren't checking in. Nobody's waking me up for some kind of x-ray or something else. And at 2 a.m., I woke up just beaming awake, completely impossible to go to sleep. Now, normally when I wake up at 2 a.m., it's because some tiny little person with 2 eyes is staring at me at the side of the bed. Not a pleasant experience. This was different. 2 a.m., I woke up completely awake. 5 minutes later, realizing I'm totally awake. So I put my headphones in, and I start listening to this song called Seasons by Hillsong United, and seeing a journey ahead and grieving the season that had led to this moment in that bed. And let me just tell you, I have a hard time describing the experience, the encounter I had with God in that moment, alone in a hospital room. In fact, if I could describe it, I wouldn't, because it's none of your business. But I can't. But let me tell you this, for every single moment that I have encountered God alone, and I spend a lot of time alone with God, he invites us to that. This relationship is between us and him. For every single moment I've encountered the greatness of God alone, there are probably 10 to 20 moments I've encountered God's greatness with other people. That when I start to think about the moments where God has shown up and spoken just the right thing, or said the right thing, or created the right thing, or brought a moment of clarity that was different than ever before, when I imagine those moments and I picture them in my mind, there's a lot of faces around me. Kind of like this moment where Matt was right here, and Pete was right here, Nate was over here, Dan was back there, another Pete was over here. There were 8 guys around me. And I had ended up there because I was about a year and a half, maybe 2 years into full-time paid ministry. Like I said, I'd been a teacher and I made this switch. A buddy of mine who was a rock star did a phenomenal job at leading young men and women to Christ and empowering volunteers. He was like Superman. And I came in behind him. And you know that stress of a new job and how it's like doubled when you come in behind somebody who's awesome, you know? I was running fast and swimming hard. I was a year and a half in trying to put on all the front of having everything together, and inside was just full of self-doubt and wondering if this mattered in any way, shape, or form, if this was even the right choice. All kinds of questioning going on in me. And so the way this thing shaped up was I was with these guys because we would get together and hang out 2 or 3 days, 3 times a year, and talk about the life of Jesus. We'd have some fun. We'd talk about the life of Jesus, how that should shape the way we help people follow him. And then on the last afternoon of each of our gatherings, one of the guys from among the group would stand up in front of the group and present all the things that they were doing in ministry because of what we were learning. And so there's all kinds of big Post-it notes and sheets of paper, and I'm writing so fast the pen's like on fire, and I'm there to like impress everybody and show how awesome and how wise I am, how sharp I am, and all these different things, and try, okay, guys, you guys are going to learn so much from this. I'm doing all the things you're teaching me, Dan. I'm doing all this, but inside I'm just absolutely full of, I don't even know if any of this stuff matters. At the end of the presentation, each time what we would do is we would sit the person down on a stool, and it was my turn, so I found myself sitting on a stool. Pete and Matt and Nate and Dan, all these different guys. And there were 2 Petes. The other Pete was over here. Pete was a guy that I'd only talked to like twice. And we didn't really have a lot of conversation. I don't know how he did this, but in a moment, God said something in my life that freed and released something that was almost 30 years in the making. That he put his hand on my shoulder, much like we did for some of you educators here, and he just prayed. And he just said, God, I pray that Drew would know how proud you are of him. And there was this moment, listen, there's something in us. I don't know, ladies, it might be true for you too, but especially for us guys, there is something that longs for the pride and approval of a father. And my earthly father had done a good job with that, but there was something in me along the way that had learned that the way you get God to like you is by being really busy in his church and doing all his stuff and working really hard and succeeding. And somehow, in this moment, in a prayer, God just said, in a moment that in my mind is just like when Jesus was baptized, the heavens open, the Spirit descends like a dove and lands on Jesus' shoulder, and God looks at him. Do you remember what he said? He said, this is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. You see, I could stand here for the next 5 or 6 hours and tell you story after story just like this, when we're God in just the right way, at just the right moment, through just the right one of his people, said something that set my life on a completely different course. The freedom that I lived with after that moment was a gift from God. I had encountered God. I had experienced God. It's what John 17:3 says, that the fullest kind of life, the best kind of life, the deepest kind of life, the most lasting kind of life, Jesus called it eternal life, begins now, and it happens when we know the one true God and the Son whom he sent. Know from experience, know from encounter, not like know about or know information of. We don't stalk God. We experience him. We know him. We walk with him. In fact, if there was one thing I hope people would say about me in my life, is that I've been one who has encountered God. I want to encounter God. I want my life to be full of his presence. And not just in moments alone, but what I'm learning is that a life full of God's presence. In fact, if you're going to write one thing down, I gave you all the space you need. Here it is. A life marked by God's presence is a life surrounded by God's people. A life marked by God's presence is a life surrounded by God's people. In fact, we're going to look at a scripture that lands this all the way in, but here's the truth, is God shows up in each of our lives, but God shows up most often through his people. God speaks through his people. God encourages through his people. God shows compassion through his people. God directs your life through his people. And so this fundamental thing about our lives is that we experience God in the midst of his people. So we should be surrounded by them. A life marked by God's presence is a life surrounded by his people. And I've known this to be true, and I bet if you followed Jesus for very long, you know this to be true too. That some of the sweetest, maybe some of the challenging, but some of the sweetest seasons, some of the times God has spoke the most clearly to you, there's a lot of faces around you. But this thing starts to creep in with us that we start to get busy and distracted and make excuses. And the thing that's right in front of us distracts us from the path toward the thing that we really want in the end. A life marked by God's presence is a life surrounded by God's people. For those of you setting out on a journey, you're curious about this whole Jesus thing, there are people out there who say, listen, I don't need the church. All I need is myself and God. And I'm going to tell you that's a bold-faced lie. That is not true. Listen, people are jacked up and they're weird. Look down the road. They're weird. You can see. They're looking at you, and they're right too. Listen, I get it. In fact, I think it was Dallas Willard said, listen, it's so hard to be in the church, I just don't know anywhere else to be a Christian. Because we need God's people. God wired us to be around God's people. God speaks through God's people. In fact, this verse that we've been building this whole year around says exactly that in a cool way that I would like to show you, that I'm stoked about, and I hope you will be too. In fact, Hebrews 12, 1 and 2 is what we've built this whole year around. Every series has been tied to this, whether you realize it or not. Let me read it for you one more time. Hebrews 12, verse 1 says this. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down and especially the sin that so easily trips us up, and let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. He says, listen, since we're surrounded by such a great crowd of witnesses to the life of faith. Now, I want to put two words together that are going to pull all of this together and shape up the next 4 weeks. The first word is crowd. Only in the original language, the word isn't crowd, it's cloud. Look down or look to the person next to you, somebody who came with it, and just say cloud right now. Go. Okay, every time you hear or see the word cloud show up or I talk about it, I want you to think God's presence, okay? Because we think of cloud and we think of, oh man, that's only like 60 days a year. Does that even happen here? And when it does, it's like an event. The heavens open and it rains, water falls from the sky. It's awesome. My kids go out and celebrate. In the Midwest, it's like every other day, it's a pain in the butt. But out here, it's celebration, right? And so, but that's not what the people who heard this letter would have thought about. You see, the people who heard this letter, it's called Hebrews because it was written to Jewish people who had decided to follow Jesus. But they had come on hard times and challenging times, and it was easy for them to abandon their faith, get distracted, look for strength somewhere else. And so this writer writes this letter to these people and says, no, hold on. Strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. The whole thing is pointing them back into this life of faith, even when it's challenging. And he says this right at the pinnacle of the book, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. To them, I don't know if they could have heard the word cloud without thinking of God's presence. And the reason is because of their history. A history that was even pointed out in Hebrews chapter 11, if you were to read that. It would have been right at the top of their minds. Because when God showed up in the history of God's people, he often showed up in a cloud. One of the first times in one of the epic stories of the Jewish people that they were trapped in slavery, 2 million of them. A family of 70 goes down to Egypt to try to survive. 400 years later, they are enslaved by the greatest empire at the time, the Egyptian Empire. And now they are 2 million people captured in slavery. But God rescued them out in this miraculous way under the leadership of this guy named Moses. And so after generations of being trapped in slavery, they're now wandering in the desert, only they're not a people who are lost. They are a people in God's presence. Because God, these 2 million people, no idea where to go, Moses included. God says, I'll show you where to go. And guess what he looked like? A cloud. A pillar of cloud went ahead of the people. And when the cloud moved, the people moved. When the cloud moved, the people moved. God said, I'll go ahead of you. You're my people. I'll take care of you. I'll show you that I'm present with you in the form of this pillar of a cloud. Now, they come up against this Red Sea, and they're like, hey, listen, God, I think the GPS steered you wrong. We are stuck. And by the way, there's this giant, massive army, strongest in the world, beating down on us, and we have nowhere to go. And so God, who is a protector, circles around behind them. And this pillar of cloud protects them. And they're still saying, listen, there's no way out. But God has this habit of making a way where we see no way. And so he opens up this path in the sea. And the people of 2 million people in the middle of a desert. You can picture this, right? 2 million people, middle of the desert. They walk through the center of the Red Sea. The Egyptian army tries to chase them. They're swallowed up when the water crashes down on them. Archaeological evidence to this day. Now this people of God are on the other side. Pillar of cloud goes ahead of them, leads them to the bottom of a mountain. And they're like, listen, we know what slavery's like. We know what it used to be like. What's it going to be like? And God says, I'll show you. I'll give you 10 commandments, and we'll line this thing up. I'll show you my character in the way I ask you to behave. But guess how he did that? He invites Moses up on top of a mountain, and guess what swallowed up the top of the mountain? A cloud. Why? Because God was present. These people experienced God's presence. They get the law and they start following through the desert, and Moses needs to figure out what to do once in a while, so he's constantly asking God. And so he goes into this tent called the tent of meeting, where he would go and meet with God. And you know how he knew God was there? A cloud. And what's the cloud represent? God's presence, right? God showed up. And then they build this big tabernacle that God had taught them to build, this huge meeting place where inside there would be people who go between God and his people. And the inner place is called the Holy of Holies. It's where God was. And so once they got the tabernacle set up, this tent set up, guess what would descend on the holy place where God's presence was to be? A cloud. Right? So when we hear cloud, we hear God's presence. Eventually, Solomon, this king, would set up a kingdom, right, with this temple built permanently that you can go see the base of it. You can see the stones that he stacked up thousands of years ago in the center of Jerusalem. And there was a holy place where God would meet with the priests once a day. And guess what happened right after they dedicate the temple? A cloud descends. And so a cloud is God's presence. Y'all with me? You're all like, we get it, please stop. But here's the thing. I don't think the Jewish people could have heard that verse read and not immediately when they heard cloud hear God's presence. But let me just show you one more time, Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge cloud, God's presence, of witnesses, God's people, to the life of faith. You see, God's presence and God's people are almost inseparable. And I think this is part of what the Hebrew author is telling us. He's saying, listen. If you want to experience God's presence, you got to be around God's people. That the way God's going to show up and surround you, now he comes right out of Hebrews 11, which I'll show you here in a second, but these two are inseparably tied. Since we are surrounded by such a great cloud, God's presence of witnesses, God's people, let us run this race. Let us live this life. Even when it's hard, let's focus, let's run really, really well and expect that God's going to show up. In fact, that's what he spent all of Hebrews chapter 11 doing. He talks about these epic times that God showed up on behalf of his people, and he points at the faith and the endurance of some of his pinnacle characters that these people would have known about. I want to show you just a few. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23. It was by faith that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months when he was born. They saw that God had given them an unusual child, and they were not afraid to disobey the king's command. Now, I don't know what they saw. I've seen some things from my kids that are pretty unusual, but I don't know. I just know that here's what happened. Moses' parents, both of them saw that God was up to something. Even though the Egyptian Pharaoh had said, listen, no more Hebrew boys, because if they all rise up, they'll take over us. We got to thin out the herd of our slave labor. But they said, no. At the risk of our lives, we're going to rescue this child. And so after 3 months, they couldn't keep the baby quiet anymore. Imagine that, a noisy 3-month-old. And so the sister places him in a basket and sends him down the river, follows the basket, and finds that the basket lands just in Pharaoh's household with Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter sees it and takes the child in and says, man, I really need somebody to feed this child. I need a wet nurse. And the sister just happens to be there and says, I happen to know someone. And God lines up mom to come in and take care of this child. This miraculous thing that God had happened. But where did people experience God's greatness? Among God's people. Moses' family together experiences the greatness of God together. Moses would grow up and find that he needed people as well. Verse 24, it said it was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt. For he was looking ahead to his great reward. It was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt. Not fearing the king's anger, he kept right on going because he kept his eyes on the one who was invisible. You see, at 40 years old, Moses would realize that he wasn't born among the Egyptian people. Even though he grew up with all the treasure of Pharaoh's house, he didn't fit. And he looked around at his people, the Hebrew people, who were treated as slaves, and he wasn't cool with that. So he stands up with one at one time and finds himself in trouble, and now he's exiled from Egypt. But the amazing thing happens. 40 years later, God shows up and calls Moses back. He surrounds him in exile. God surrounds him with great people, and he sends him back, surrounded by family, Aaron and his sister Miriam. And they stand before the greatest king on the planet at the time and says, hey, man, God said you should let your 2 million slaves go, just so you know. And Pharaoh's like, let me think about it. No. But over coming weeks, over coming months, God would do the miraculous in the context of his people. Moses experienced the greatness of God, but where did he experience it? In the context of his people. It goes on and says this in verse 28. It was by faith that Moses commanded the people of Israel to keep the Passover and sprinkle blood on the doorposts so that the angel of death would not kill their firstborn sons. You see, the 10th way that God finally convinced Pharaoh to let people go was he was going to take the firstborn of every family who did not acknowledge him or trust that he was God. Even though he had shown in 9 other ways that he was God, he's like, nope, some people still don't get it. So here's what you're going to do. If you trust me, I want you to put the blood of a lamb over the doorpost of your house. I want you to take your family and your friends and your community. I want you to go in. I want you to have a feast inside and celebrate together because today God's going to rescue you. And that's exactly what happened. The people experienced the great rescue of God. The next day, Pharaoh says, get out. And 2 million people set out in the desert. They experienced God's greatness, but how did they experience it? With God's people. You see, if you want to live a life marked by God's presence, you got to live a life surrounded by God's people. The same thing would happen in the Red Sea. We've already talked about it. He made a way. And I've got to think that all those people, 2 million people on the other side of the thing, is like, what just happened? They experienced God's greatness, his rescue. But where did they experience it? Together. Since we're surrounded by such a great cloud, God's presence, of witnesses, God's people. So all of this leads up to one really, really simple question. Simplest thing ever. Challenging to live out. Are you ready? Who are you surrounded by? Do you want to live a life marked by God's presence? Then we got to prioritize a life surrounded by God's people. It's where he'll speak. It's where he shows up. Let me ask you, as you think about the people that surround you, who's the one who tells you the truth when you don't want to hear it? Who is the one who's ready to step into your life and say, hey, I know that you're headed this way, but God says this? Who's the one that sharpens your thinking about God, challenges you to a next step, refuses to let you remain complacent? Who's the one who steps in with God's encouragement and says, you can do this. I got you. I'm with you. God's with you. He hasn't forgotten you. He hasn't lost you. He knows exactly where you are. He knows exactly what's next. You can keep going. Who are those people? Listen, having good people around you, good friends, is a huge part of life. We want to be a church where you find great friends, but we want you to be surrounded by people who are headed the same direction as you. Surrounded by this cloud, God's presence of witnesses in God's people. In fact, this whole verse in chapter 12 has this image of people cheering one another on in a race. Who's cheering you on toward God? One of the races I had done some years ago, I did some road running, and that got boring. Did some obstacle races, that got boring. And so I started doing this relay race with some teams, which was cool. It's called Ragnar. There's a couple different versions. There's a road one where you stay in vans all night. I'm not into that. And there's a trail one where you camp, and I'm into that. And so me and a team of 7 other guys, all Air Force guys and girl, went and decided to run this race. And the deal is you end up running about 15 miles each in 3 different legs of a race, end to end to end, and you stay up, and sometimes you run at 7 p.m., and sometimes your race comes up at 2 a.m., and you're running underneath the stars, and you're climbing up these mountains. It's like 3,000 feet of elevation change over 15 miles. You're exhausted, you're beat down, you're dirty, you're scratched up, and it's awesome. Some of you are like, you are a lunatic. It was awesome, but there's this cool thing that happens. Happened with every single team, saw it every single time. In fact, I saw it happen between teams. That as the race came to an end, as the last person came stumbling and bumbling and dragging themselves toward the finish line about a quarter or a half mile out, that person was met by 7 other people who had all finished the same legs, been in the same places, been scratched by the same bushes, fell over the same rocks, climbed the same hill wondering if it would ever end, meet up with them and surround them. And they start running together. And this person who could barely put one foot in front of the other, now surrounded by their team, all of a sudden they were like a sprinter. You know what I'm saying? It was an ugly sprint, don't get me wrong, but like a sprint. and finish this race together. This is the image of Hebrews chapter 12. That God's presence shows up in God's people. He uses Hebrews 11 to talk about people from the past because there are people who have finished the race, and we should draw strength and wisdom and knowledge from those people and encouragement that it can be done. But it's also this image of people who surround us right now, who are experiencing the things that we have right now, who see our pain right now, who remember the rock that you just tripped over, who are ready to hand you a fresh bottle of water and finish that line and celebrate with you the goodness of what God's up to in your life. You see, God's presence and God's people are inseparable. And so who surrounds you? Who's cheering you on? Who takes you from a dragging, barely able to put one foot in front of the other and speaks courage into your life? That you go from a dragging, barely standing up to a sprint in the direction of Jesus. That makes you better. That makes you sharper. That when you're together, you always experience God's presence. That you could recount the number of times over and over and over, the times where they have spoken, and even though it was their voice, you heard straight from God. Like my buddy Joel, who I went into his office next to mine 6 months into youth ministry and said, dude, I don't know what I'm doing. And he looks at me, and in Joel's voice, but straight from God, says, this is the kind of leader that you are. Reshaped everything in a moment. Because we ran together, he was able to see and he was able to say exactly what God wanted to say to me in that moment. Who are those people for you? We want those people, don't we? You don't stumble into groups like that. You don't wander accidentally into relationships like that. You prioritize relationships like that. You see, I don't know a Christian on the planet who would disagree or have heard anything new in what I've said in the last 25 minutes. But here's what I do know. There are thousands of them whose busy schedules have carried them out of those groups. There are thousands of them who have tiny little excuses about today, tomorrow, and the next day that are robbing them of becoming the kind of person they dream of being 6 months, a year down the road. And so we don't discipline ourselves. We don't step into that. There are people who have been hurt and are afraid, and I get it. But the truth is God's presence is most often experienced with God's people. And you want those people, don't you? When you're celebrating the goodness of life, like when I stepped into this role and my buddy flew from the Midwest to come out here, that celebration was so sweet. Hanging out, watching the nights with my life group and this guy who surprised me from nowhere. Those are the kind of people I need in my life. Those are the people who make me run strong. In those moments of desperation when everything is terrible. You know those moments, right? Those are the people you want to show up. Like when I came out of anesthetic at the hospital after that surgery, first surgery I've ever gone through in January. And I don't even remember seeing anything. What I remember is I remember holding my wife's hand and hearing her talk to me. And I remember the chairman of the elders, a friend of mine, a doctor in the room, and he's talking about Jesus with the nurse. And I'm just like, I have the best people. And over the next 6 days in the cardiac ICU or whatever, one after one, day after day, a different guy from my life group shows up with food, which is clutch. Take notes. And allows me to complain and hear the challenge, celebrate the victory, to make me laugh so much that I had to grab onto that heart pillow so the whole thing didn't explode again. And when my buddy Brendan writes up on the board, goals for today, you know how that, here's your nurse, here's the person, and all this stuff, goals for today, he put 50 push-ups. He's like, nope. Dude, those moments, we want those people. Do you have those people? Can I just tell you, I don't know, I mean, you and I haven't hung out that much, but I just want to tell you straight to your heart, you need those people. I don't care who you are. I don't care where I need those people, and you need those people. And God shows up in those kind of people, and those people are worth prioritizing. I know there's steps. I know there's awkward. I know it doesn't always work. I know that people are smelly and weird and expensive and costly and annoying and all those things. But they're also where you meet God. They're the people that we need. You need those people. And so if you've had those people and summer has detached you from those people, you got to rally those people. And if you've never had those people, you got to find those people. We want to be a church where to help you find those people. We know it's a disconnected city. We know some of you just got here. Some of you might be ready to head off to the next place. I don't know. I know there's lots of reasons people are disconnected and lonely. We want to be a place where we find great friends. It's why we talk about life groups. It's why we ask people to engage, to sit down in a circle, to brave the awkward, to look at what God has said and daringly point one another and encourage one another and cheer one another in the direction of Jesus. And we know that can be challenging. We know it doesn't always work, but we try and we try and we try because God has said, and we go after it. And so you filled out a card. If you have that, grab that card. If you didn't fill it out because you didn't think community was important, I hope God in the last 20 minutes changed your mind. Because you need those people. And so some buckets are going to come past. And if you don't know how to get into that group, you don't know how to surround yourself, you don't have a way to connect with other people, you want to step maybe for the first time into a relationship with people who are heading the direction of Jesus, all I want you to do is take that card, mark one of those things, and drop it in the bucket. Later this month, you're going to sit down across a circle. Let me tell you something. I promise, everyone at your table is going to be weird. Every single one, including you. And yet, there's something beautiful that God does when people choose to stumble in His direction together. And so you lean in, at least for a season, and find out if God isn't right. Find out if He didn't mean it. That we can be surrounded by a great cloud, God's presence, of witnesses, God's people, to this life of faith. Don't say no. Don't let little excuses keep you away. God has great things in mind, and He'll show up. In fact, we're going to be shaping this whole thing over the next couple or 3 weeks. As those buckets pass, as you drop those things in, as you brave the connection event to step into maybe what could be the greatest friends in the next season of your life. Let me just tell you, next week we're going to talk about how Jesus points us carefully to surround ourselves really well. We're going to look at how Jesus did this and how His followers did this. The following week, we're going to talk about why is it that God shows up with God's people. And the beautiful thing from the Old Testament to the New Testament, the history of God's people to God's people now, is that because of Jesus, God's Spirit is in us. And so the way we encounter God and His Spirit is in God's people because God's Spirit is in God's people. And so we're going to talk about the Spirit's role and how we step into community really, really well, how we develop great friends that point us toward Jesus. And then the fourth week, and including Night of Worship on September 4th, which I'm super stoked for, we're going to talk about what happens when you experience God's greatness together. It's what happened on the side of the Red Sea, I'm convinced. It's what happened when they woke up the morning after the celebration of Passover. It's what happened every single time the tent was packed up and moved along and came to just the right spot. That people stood back together after experiencing God's greatness, and they just said, God, you're the best. And in the church, we call that worship. So we're going to talk about that response on the fourth week, and especially a Night of Worship as we launch into this fall. Listen, God has some phenomenal things in mind for our church this fall. I cannot wait to share all of them with you on the Night of Worship, to cast a vision and a picture of what's going on. Some of you guys are getting glimpses already. God has great things in mind, but let me just tell you, the place you primarily experience the greatness of God is with God's people. Here we want to be a people marked by God's presence, to experience the divine, the transcendent all the time. He's invited us to. We should expect to. But a life that's marked by God's presence is always a life that's surrounded by God's people. And so this week, take some steps to start surrounding yourself with God's people. Would you stand and pray with me? And so, God, you always go first, and so I pray that you would go ahead, that you would start shaping the kind of people that surround us, God, that no one would be confused or deceived to think that they either should do it alone or could do this alone. God, life with people is challenging, but it's the best. And you show up in your people. And so, God, point us toward your people. Would you shape thousands of groups? People who would surround one another, cheer one another on, encourage one another, support one another, give to one another, sharpen one another. God, all these things that you've called us into, invited us into, given us, blessed us with, God, would you point the way into great, great, great friendships that we could run hard in your direction, God, that we would experience more and more of you, and their lives would be full of moments of just saying, wow, moments of worship because you showed up in your people. God, would you make a way for us? It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.